So when we look at part of the risks of AI and just these different new societal trends or technologies or whatever the case may be, it's important to take into consideration what the risks are, where that threshold sits between issue versus crisis. So, what that means for your organization, because those response patterns are going to be different. And if once you define that threshold, then you know when to trigger a more kind of a more proactive or just a different type of approach, a more serious approach, for example, of response.
Hi, I'm James Taylor, business creativity and innovation keynote speaker, and this is The Creative Life, a show dedicated to you, the creative. If you're looking for motivation, inspiration, and advice while at home, at work, or on your daily commute, then this show is for you. Each episode brings you a successful creative, whether that's an author, musician, entrepreneur, performer, designer, or thought leader. They'll share with you their journey, their successes, their failures, their creative process, and much, much more. You'll find show notes for this episode as well as free training on creativity over at jamestaylor.me. Enjoy this episode. Hey there, it's James Taylor, and I'm delighted to welcome onto the show today Melissa Agnes. Melissa Agnes is the author of Crisis Ready, Building an Invincible Brand in an Uncertain World, and she's the leading authority on crisis preparedness, reputation management, and brand protection. She is a coveted speaker, commentator, and advisor to some of the world's leading organizations faced with the greatest risks. As a strategic advisor and keynote speaker, Melissa has worked with NATO, Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Defense, financial firms, technology companies, and healthcare organizations in helping them to understand risk and build invincible brands that can withstand even the most devastating of events. Melissa is the editor of the Crisis Ready blog, a contributor to Forbes, and a go-to source for the press, with recent coverage including the Wall Street Journal and USA Today. As a university guest lecturer, she teaches crisis management in university courses around the world, including at NYU and McGill, and it's my great pleasure to have her with us today. So welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having me, James. It's a pleasure to be here.
Share with everyone what's happening in your world just now.
What's happening in my world? Oh, so much happens in my world. A whole bunch of stuff. So my book came out earlier this year, so that is happening in my world. And kind of just advising some really great organizations and launching some new products to help even more organizations and law enforcement and just a whole bunch of stuff. Life as an entrepreneur. Go, go, go.
So I know for a lot of our listeners, when we think about risk, brand crisis preparedness, actually, probably one of the bigger ones for them is reputational risk. When something happens, and if the key of the intellectual property is about them as a brand, whether that's because they're a well-known author or a speaker, or an artist, a musician, that's something that they have to protect against. Is there things that everyone from a defense company would share with an author in terms of how they have to protect their brand?
Absolutely. So every organization, every business, every human has a series of high-risk scenarios that are the most likely high-impact types of issues and crises that they're the most prone and vulnerable to. So whether you're a solopreneur, an entrepreneur, CEO of a mega corporation, every single business has their own set of high-risk, most high-impact, high-risk situations. Understanding what those are for your business, for your livelihood, for your life is essential, because then you can prevent the preventable and be prepared for the unpreventable. And that's kind of what my book is all about.
So I know in your book you have this pyramid where you talk about ways to think about risk. It's a visual kind of representation, a conceptual model of how to think about risk and preparedness. And at the very base of that, it starts with this idea of doing an audit, like you were just talking about there. This idea of looking into the different risks that might, and you mentioned this idea of a high risk scenario. So let's imagine someone, if they were, for example, if they were a professional speaker, let's say. I know we have a lot of professional speakers. You speak professionally, I speak professionally. What are some of those high risk for someone like a professional speaker?
So it would be anything that would impact your livelihood. So as a professional speaker, if that could be anything from natural disaster that prevents you from getting to a gig to your client, it could be anything from falling ill or somebody in your close family falling ill and you can't work, right? Inability to perform your duties, your responsibilities. It can be something like, depending on who you speak for, having a data breach where your client's data is, depending on what kind of data you have. Again, so crises or high risk scenarios for one organization or one person or business doesn't necessarily translate to everybody. So it's about looking at what are the ones that pertain to you, leave you exposed and vulnerable, and then again, how can you prevent what you can prevent? So natural disaster or natural disaster. If something like that were to inhibit your ability to get to a client, you can build that into your contract, for example. That's a high risk scenario, right? It's a very likely scenario for a speaker because we travel all around the world constantly. We're constantly on planes. And so if that were to inhibit our ability to perform and to, go through with our responsibility, we can build that into our contracts that give us a clause that say, in the event of, act of God, for example, here is the protocol. Here's what we're going to do. I'm going to keep my money, but I'm going to give you another date, for example, just putting that very, layman terms. So it's about understanding what those risks are and then putting measures in place to protect yourself.
I remember once talking to someone who specializes in helping journalists who are going to very risky countries to cover stories. And he was saying to me, he said, what do you think is the most risky part? If I send a journalist for the BBC or for CNN to, certain types of war zone, and I said, well, I would imagine, once they're in the field and they're getting there and they're around live fire, and he said that is pretty risky. But actually, statistically, the riskiest part is going from their home to the airport. Because that's what you're most likely to be involved in a car incident or something like that. And he said once you as you said, you start to figure out what those risks are and identify those risks, then you can look at starting ways to mitigate those. This area of brand reputation, risk management, how does someone get into? How did you get into this world?
I laugh because I get asked this question all the time, and it's never what people think. So I've been an entrepreneur my entire adult life since I was 21, and at the time, almost a decade ago, I was doing brand strategies. So it was right at the cusp when organizations were realizing that they should be on social and that social presented opportunity. And that's what we were doing. We were doing digital brand strategies, social media marketing, and website development, all of these things. And the way that my brain works, and it always has, just the way that I'm wired, is I see risk everywhere. I jump to all of the mitigation strategies for those risks, and then the opportunity through the mitigation. If I were to put my brain on kind of this linear track to describe it, that is the fashion in which I process things. And so I remember one morning about 9 or 10 years ago reading up on, just my morning readings, and it struck me, why is nobody talking about the risk involved with social media, the risk involved with technology as a whole, with the real-time news cycle that had just begun to evolve, with the expectations of consumers today, where we expect brands to speak with us, not at us, and we expect response back and all of these things. And it was a light bulb moment for me, and it spoke to the wiring of my being. So for the next year, I realized in that moment that crisis management was a thing. I didn't know that before. And for the next year, I just devoured everything that I could on the subject. And yet nothing was talking about these new realities that were impacting our society and our business today. And I kept turning to my business partner at the time and saying, there's something here. I just don't have all the answers yet. I haven't figured out all the answers. And about a year into my, quote unquote studies, I got a call from a client. It was a real estate investment trust, so a public company that invests in real estate, and their primary stakeholders are their investors. And we had just launched their website the week before. And the VP calls me very early one morning in a hyper panic saying, our president's in the car with a prospective investor. The radio is reporting that one of our buildings is about to explode. It's not true. Investors are calling off the hook. We're going to lose this prospective investor. Apparently the rumor started on Twitter. We have no idea what Twitter is, but we hear it's a digital thing. And since you just launched our website, we're hoping you can help us. And so, right person to call. Within a half an hour, I had the media correcting themselves. I had the information getting to investors because investors weren't going to Twitter. Anyways, long story short, the next day I got a call from the president of the company who said, not only did our unit price not go down since yesterday, it actually went up a cent. So thank you so much. And that was my, oh my goodness, I can serve. This is I'm good at this. This is a natural aptitude that I have. It's a passion, and it's something that could really, really be of use and of value to the organizations that I serve. So I decided to jump, and I was a young entrepreneur with not a lot of money. So I started a blog. I blogged 5 days a week for years, right place, right time. I was the first person pretty much in the world to start really vocalizing these concerns and these big questions that I thought companies should be asking themselves, and giving answers and solutions and strategies for approach. And right place, right time. I got these long-standing crisis management professionals come to me and say, we don't know if this whole digital thing is a fad or a trend, and we don't know how long it's going to last, and we're nearing retirement, so we don't necessarily want to learn it, but we're smart enough to know that our clients could use your services. Can we partner? And that's, I laugh because I know the story is coming. Yeah, and that's what started the journey. And it's still the thing that makes me jump out of bed every morning. I love what I do.
Now, to exemplify that, I know one of the, I think you wrote a foreword for your book, or you wrote a quote in your book was Dave Carroll. Which if people don't know him, there was a really fantastic video that came out called United Breaks Guitars, where he was a musician and he was touring. And he actually saw his guitar as it was being taken from the plane and basically destroyed almost in front of him by one of the crew. And it was so horrendous for him that he, unlike what most people would do, was to write a very stern letter and try and get recompense. He went the content marketing way, and he actually created a video for it. I remember speaking to him a few months ago, and he said, I think it was when that video came out, it became such a viral hit, and so many other people, in the musicians especially, retweeted it and shared it. I think the company lost about $100 million in stock valuation almost overnight. So I guess that can lead you to be, when we come to think about risk management, we think of those big things, but those customers and are coming into interaction with our brands every day, they have they're influencers, and some of them could be influencers at a pretty significant scale, even if they don't necessarily have lots of Twitter followers.
You'd never know. If you look at, so there was this case of a woman named Justine Stacco, who was a VP, I believe, of comms for a really big organization. And she's South African. And she was about to board a plane a few years ago. It's a case study in my book. She was talking about a personal brand, right? She worked for a large organization. She had a prominent position within a large organization. And she was boarding a plane, I think a 11 or a 13-hour flight to South Africa. And she tweeted out sarcastically. I'm paraphrasing here, but basically it said, I'm on my way to South Africa. Hope I don't catch AIDS. Oh, just kidding. I'm white. Something like that. I'm paraphrasing, but that was the tweet. And she meant it as an ironic laugh at ignorance, where people, she did not mean that literally. Mm-hmm. And yet she tweeted that. I think she had something like 147 followers on Twitter. She got on board her flight. 11 or 13 hours later, when she landed, her phone exploded, metaphorically exploded, and she had lost her job. The story went viral. There were people waiting for her at the airport to take her picture, all because of this one tweet that was taken out of context, and because she was disconnected from the digital world for such a long period of time, she didn't have the capacity or the ability to defend herself and to come out. So it skyrocketed. It went viral. She had 147 followers. It took one person within her following to see the tweet and to send it off, and it exploded like that. And it changed her world dramatically. It does. We can't. Dave Carroll, to your point, Dave Carroll brilliantly says, no one customer or client should be seen as statistically insignificant. Yeah. And those are beautiful examples as why that matters.
So I'm thinking now you work with also a lot of large organizations who, in addition to, as I said, looking around their risk, they have this relatively new type of risk that's perhaps coming up with using things like artificial intelligence and machine learning in their organizations. And I speak a lot about AI, and we start to use things like conversational AIs, which is like having it's almost like a chat bot with email where you're having conversations. And I know, speaking to the companies that create some of those systems, a big challenge that they have is how, you think the customers think they're having often a conversation with a real human being. And what if that conversation goes off into a place you do not want it to go off into? And then that has reputational brand risk for the company. So what are you finding as we're starting to get into these new areas of things like obviously chatbots and conversational AI? How companies having to think about that for their risk?
It's important to look at what the risks are. It's also really important to define what an issue versus a crisis is. And the other part of that is, so the reason that Dave Carroll's United Breaks Guitars videos went as viral and had such an impact was because they were the first of their kind. He was the first consumer to stand up and say, I'm not going to stand for this. And for that, I'm not going to stand for this, to have such a significant impact on such a mega brand. That was the first of its kind in our world. It was groundbreaking. So when we look at part of the risks of AI and just these different new societal trends or technologies or whatever the case may be, it's important to take into consideration what the risks are, where that threshold sits between issue versus crisis. So what that means for your organization, because those response patterns are going to be different. And if once you define that threshold, then you know when to trigger a more kind of a more proactive or just a different type of approach, a more serious approach, for example, of response. And then to take into consideration that if this has never happened before, if you're looking at these risks and they've never happened before and your brand is the first to go through them, there is even higher risk associated to that risk as a result of that. So that's also another important one to realize, because when you're the first, whether it's good or bad, it gets amplified because you're the first. So that's an important consideration to take into account that that often goes overlooked.
It's funny. I was just having a conversation with a friend of mine. He promotes Tony Robbins events. He's a speaker, and he just promoted an event, 26,000 attendees at this event in Moscow. And it was the biggest event. The work broke Guinness World Records and everything. But there was a couple of issues, because when you run an event as big as that, especially for the first time in a country which hasn't been doing events like that, as big as that, there were always going to be issues. And one of the issues, I think, was the AC. It was just really hot in the room because the AC was just... And he said we got so much attention in the news about that. And it was kind of negative. We were having to do that. He said I'm also trying to balance this thing of like, okay, I'm getting this negative thing in the press because it got really hot and people, it got really hot, but I'm also looking at this other standpoint from the perspective of, would it have had that news? Would it have been in the news if it hadn't been the first event of its kind? If it had just been another 26,000 event which is happening all the time, it would have never had any kind of pickup from the media.
Agreed. And let's put that into context. That's an issue. A crisis would be a terrorist threat at that, groundbreaking first time event. So important to manage, important to respond to, important to not enable or permit it to chip away at the trust and credibility of the brand as a whole. So effective issue management is essential, but also important to put into context and draw those thresholds of when is it an issue versus when is it a crisis.
So as you've been going along this journey and getting more and more into this whole world of crisis management and reputational risk, was there a key light bulb moment or an insight when you went, okay, this is my unique take on this, or this is how I think I can move the topic forward, or bring this topic to wider attention?
My aha moment was really in that moment, like 9 years ago, when I went, holy, why is nobody talking about this? Why is nobody addressing it? That was really the biggest light bulb moment, I think, of my life to date. And since then, it hasn't necessarily... I do talk about it differently than everybody else. I have created a name for myself in the industry where I have a unique take on this, and I have a unique way of seeing it, and I have a unique way of teaching it and implementing it with organizations. And I think it's not necessarily a light bulb moment that said, I have this. It's just who I am. And it's that passion that drives, I want to help and serve as many organizations as I can, because I believe this is really important and of value and essential. So kind of just the propelling of the passion behind it that enables me to keep going. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, and I know we've got a lot of speakers. We've got a lot of speakers that listen to this show as well and watch this show. And on a topic like that, we think of that risk management. That's a topic that could, if you go to a conference, could often get put into the side rooms, the breakout sessions. But you as a keynote speaker, you get on the main stages. So I'm also interested to know, it's like, how have you been able to elevate that from a topic where we think of it as almost it's a box to be ticked, let's stick it to the breakout room, to actually you are on the main stage talking about this and sharing ideas about this?
So that's a brilliant question because that took a long time. It took because you're spot on that people think when I was branded as a crisis management strategist. That is what I did. I'm an advisor to some great organizations. So that was my positioning. And when I found a passion in keynote speaking, my agent, my director of events, and I really sat down, and for a year, it took us a solid year to figure out that positioning. How do we get people realizing that this message is grander, is more important than just exactly what you described, that box and for a siloed, piece of an audience or part of an organization, because it's not. And that became it. There was a myriad of things that happened. I spent a year really trying to figure that out, and that meant having conversations with the incredibly brilliant people that I'm very blessed to be surrounded by, just conversation after conversation after conversation. It also lent to looking for the subtitle of my book. So my book is Crisis Ready, Building an Invincible Brand in an Uncertain World. And the second I got that Invincible Brand piece, that came from having conversations with friends where they would say, what happens when your clients go into crisis? And knock on wood, my response was always, my clients don't have crises because they're crisis ready.
Yeah.
And that lent to I help organizations build brand invincibility, which is exactly what I do, which the second I nailed the subtitle of my book was that aha moment of, oh my goodness, that's my positioning. And so that's how I've positioned myself as a speaker and continue to position myself as a speaker. It's an ongoing event or initiative. But it was that piece. It was alternating that piece where now I'm speaking to leadership. I'm speaking to brand management. I'm speaking to marketing and communications and PR. I'm speaking to CEOs and CIOs. And so it just opens up who wants an invincible brand. That means it's a touch point across the organization. It's cross-organizational, which is the work that I do, is cross-organizational. It's not siloed.
Yeah, that was a very smart move on your side. And I think that's a very hard thing to do, to take a topic. I was having a conversation the other day with a speaker who speaks on kind of really project management. And he had exactly the same issue, like how do you move that from a breakout place to where actually you are on the opening keynote or the closing keynote, and it's often is a positioning piece, and sometimes it's just that phrase. And you said, invincible brand, brand, that word brand goes especially to the higher parts of the organization, to the leadership. It doesn't get put down into a compliance issue, let's say, as well. So that, you've done a very good job. It's a great move there. What about tools? Are there any online tools or apps that you find very useful in doing the work that you do?
As an entrepreneur, yes. So I don't have a big enough team to support my craziness yet. And tools like Calendly and Stripe and, Google, I mean, like the Gmail suites and all of that, those are... When I discovered Calendly and Stripe and the way they can play together, and then Jotform and like SurveyMonkey, all of these things and the way that they can play together was it was like having a virtual assistant that I just hired. That was that's a recent this year discovery for me, and one that I'm extremely grateful for.
And before we started recording, I know we were both kind of geeking out on maybe a slightly more low tech tool that we both have, which is these things, our journals.
Yes.
And I've yet to meet an author or speaker who doesn't have these and obsess about these, and that pleasure that you have when you got a brand new one that just arrives.
Totally,
I think you've had some that just went through the mail. So are you when you're doing are you a kind of morning pages type journaler, or are you using your journal more for just getting those notes, getting things out of your brain onto the page?
So my notebook is my everything. We made a joke earlier before recording, which was if you take my purse, which has my laptop and my wallet and my phone, and I would say, just leave me my notebook. Like, take everything else is replaceable, but leave me my notebook. I write, and it's constantly next to me. I don't leave the house without it. I will remember my notebook before I remember my phone. I sometimes have to come back into the house to get my phone, but I always have my notebook with me. And it's yesterday morning my eyes were still closed. I was lying in bed and I had this thing going on in my head. And the second before, I think that I started moving, because my notebook sleeps next to me on the bed. Before, I started moving to grab my pen before my eyes even opened to get those ideas out of my head and onto paper. So it's an everyday thing. It's also a way to, at the end of the day, I'll go and I'll listen to live jazz with Manhattan and my notebook, and I'll kind of just decompress and get my thoughts out and start internalizing and assessing whatever it is that I need to to do to continue to evolve forward as a human and as an entrepreneur. So that's a long-winded way to say it is an all-time everyday thing.
So we were geeking out, and I know today you're in Montreal. You're about to make a move to the US, to New York as well, and you mentioned some jazz there. If you were to recommend just one album to people to check out, to listen, something you're really into just now, or it's like an evergreen favorite, what would that album be?
Oh man, just one. Those are two different questions. What I'm into now and an evergreen favorite. Which one would you like?
Let's go for the evergreen favorite.
Oh, well then that's an easy one. That is Rolling Stone's Greatest Hits. That if I was trapped on an island for the rest of my life with only one album, that would be my album of choice.
Fantastic. We'll put that there as well. And what about a book? I'd like you to recommend a book, not your own book, we're going to have links to that here, but a book by another author. It could be on just something that you've maybe gifted more often to other people, or something that you've recommended more often to people.
So there's several, but I am thinking about who we're speaking to, and we're speaking to creatives. So in alignment with that, it would be Miracle Morning. That is a small, simple book with, if you actually put it into practice, offers such a powerful reward. And just gift to whatever you're moving forward towards.
Fantastic. I think that's Hal Elrod and Honoré Corder.
Yes.
I've interviewed. Honoré's amazing, and the thing I love about that book is what they've done now is they've made it into a series. So I think you get like the Miracle Morning for executives, a Miracle Morning for parents, a Miracle Morning for partners. So they've done a chicken soup for the soul with it.
Awesome. Good for them.
Whatever your flavor. That's great. So we're going to put that link there as well. And if we're obviously talking about your book, we're going to have a link here to Crisis Ready, so people can go and get their copies. And if people want to reach out to you more generally to learn more about your work, maybe they're looking to have some kind of consultation, some advice work, where's the best place for them to go and do that?
melissaagnes.com. You will find everything there. No matter what your organization is, there's going to be resources there for you that are all free. I also have things like a webinar series, which isn't free, but it's a tiny piece of money investment, and it's a 6-part series that brings you right through to wherever you currently are, to building brand invincibility. So there's a ton of resources there for you, depending on where you're at and what your business is and what you're looking for.
Fantastic. We're going to have all those links here below. Melissa, thank you so much for coming on today. I wish you all the best with your new move that you're about to do as well. I wish you all the best with filling those lovely journals, those lovely new journals with lots of wonderful ideas that we're going to see in books in the future.
Awesome. Thank you so much for having me, James. It's been a pleasure.
If you're interested in living a more creative life, then I'd love to invite you to join me as I share some of the most successful strategies and techniques that high-performing creatives use. I put them all together in a free downloadable ebook that you can get by going to jamestaylor.me. That's jamestaylor.me to get your free downloadable ebook on creativity.